As parents arrived for afternoon pickup at the daycare, one particular scene caught an experienced caregiver's attention. Amid the usual happy reunions, something was terribly wrong as she noticed a little girl's uncharacteristic hesitation to leave with her father. Years of working with children had given her an almost sixth sense for trouble, and the situation just didn't feel right. Following her gut feeling, she made the fateful decision to trail behind them, a choice that would uncover a horrifying truth she desperately wished wasn't real. Why didn't the girl want to leave with her dad? And what horrifying secret would the caregiver discover? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jessica Lane glanced at the clock on the colorful wall of Sprout Daycare in Tacoma, Washington. It read 5:45 p.m., signaling that the day was winding down and parents would soon arrive to collect their children. At 27, Jessica had been working as a caregiver at the daycare for several years, and the routine of pickup time was familiar to her. She reached for her phone, tapping the screen to check the notifications. The daycare had recently upgraded its system with a new app and barcode system at the administration desk, allowing caregivers to see which parents were en route and who had already checked in to pick up their children. This technological upgrade had significantly improved security measures for the kids. As Jessica scrolled through the notifications, she noticed that Emily Carter was next on the list, and her mother was already on her way. With this information, Jessica knew she needed to prepare Emily for pickup. The playground area was bustling with activity as Jessica made her way there. Children's laughter and excited chatter filled the air, a cacophony of joy that always brought a smile to her face. She scanned the area, searching for Emily among the sea of small faces and colorful clothing. Finally, she spotted the girl at the slide, giggling with her friends as they took turns sliding down. Jessica approached, her steps measured and calm, not wanting to startle the children. "Emily," she called out gently, "it's time to get ready, darling. Your mum will be here any moment to pick you up." The change in Emily's demeanor was instantaneous and startling. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of distress. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to go home. Please, I want to stay here." Jessica crouched down to Emily's level, her voice soft and understanding. "I know you're having fun with your friends, Emily, and that's wonderful, but it's time to go home now. Don't worry, though, you'll be back tomorrow to play again." But Emily was not consoled. Her distress escalated quickly into a full-blown tantrum. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she repeated, "No, no, no, please, I don't want to go home." The girl backed up against the wall beneath the slide platform, a wooden structure that made it difficult for Jessica to reach her without crawling. Jessica remained where she was, crouched at Emily's level, not wanting to invade the child's space. She observed Emily's upset expression, and for a brief moment she felt a twinge of concern. Something about this reaction seemed different from the usual tantrums she'd witnessed over the years during drop-off and pick-up hours. Realizing that force wouldn't work in this situation, Jessica opted for a gentler approach. "Emily," she said softly, "can you tell me why you don't want to leave? What's bothering you, sweetheart?" Emily's sobs subsided slightly as she looked at Jessica with tear-filled eyes. Here it's better than at home," she managed between hiccups. "Everyone is so kind to each other here. At home, it's different." Jessica's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean by different, Emily? Can you explain?" But before Emily could answer, the sharp ring of the doorbell cut through the air. Jessica suspected it was Emily's mother, arriving to collect her daughter. "Listen, Emily," Jessica said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice. "Did you hear that bell? I think your mommy is here. Let's go to the door together, okay?" Emily shook her head vigorously, still refusing to budge from her spot under the slide. Jessica took a deep breath, considering her options. "Okay, Emily, how about this? You can play for just 5 more minutes while I go talk to your mum. But after that..." She pointed to the clock on the wall. "We have to go. Do you promise?" Jessica extended her pinky finger, offering it to Emily for a pinky promise. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting between Jessica's face and her outstretched finger. After a moment, she gave a small nod, but didn't lock fingers with Jessica. Taking the nod as agreement, Jessica stood up. "All right, 5 more minutes," she reminded Emily gently. As she turned to leave, she caught the eye of a nearby staff member. "Could you keep an eye on Emily for me?" she asked, receiving a nod in response. With one last glance at Emily, who had cautiously emerged from under the slide, Jessica made her way to the front desk, her mind still puzzling over Emily's strange behavior and cryptic words. Jessica's footsteps echoed in the hallway as she made her way to the front reception area. She expected to see the familiar face of Emily's mother, but instead she was greeted by the sight of a man standing at the desk. His presence caught her off guard, and she approached with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you with anything?" Jessica asked, her voice polite but tinged with a hint of wariness. The man turned to face her, a friendly smile on his face. "Yes, I'm here to collect Emily Carter," he said. Jessica's confusion deepened. She quickly checked the system again, confirming what she already knew. Emily was supposed to be picked up by her mother. No other guardian's name was registered in their records. The new system they had implemented was designed to only release children after scanning a barcode from the registered guardian's phone, a measure put in place to ensure the children's safety. "I'm sorry, sir," Jessica began, choosing her words carefully, "but our records show that Emily is supposed to be picked up by her mother. We can only release children to registered guardians after scanning their barcode. It's a security measure, you understand." The man's smile didn't falter. He reached into his pocket and produced a phone. "Oh, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned. I brought my wife's phone with me. Emily's mother had an important thing to do at home, so she couldn't make it to pick her up." Jessica hesitated for a moment before accepting the phone. "Of course, let me just check that for you," she said, her fingers moving deftly across the screen. True to the man's word, the account was indeed logged in with Emily's mother's credentials. She navigated to the barcode generation screen and scanned it into the computer before handing the phone back. As she returned the device, Jessica took a closer look at the man. There was something familiar about him, and after a moment of contemplation, recognition dawned. She remembered him from a parent greeting event nearly a year ago. This was Mark Carter, Emily's father. "Mr. Carter," Jessica said, her tone warming slightly with recognition, "I remember you from last year's parent event. I apologize for not recognizing you right away." Mark's smile widened. "No worries at all. It's been a while, hasn't it? Actually, I wanted to mention, in the coming days, Emily's mother might not be able to pick her up every day. She's found a new job, you see." Jessica nodded understandingly. "Of course, we can certainly accommodate that. Would you like me to register you as a guardian in our system? That way you'll have your own account and barcode for future pickups." "That would be great, thank you," Mark agreed. Jessica guided him through the process, helping him install the app on his phone and creating a new Guardian account under the name Mark Carter. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice a slight tension in Mark's demeanor, despite his friendly facade. She chalked it up to the stress of a new routine and pushed the thought aside. With the administrative tasks complete, Jessica opened the gate and gestured for Mark to enter. He slipped off his shoes and stepped through the small, child-sized gate. Together, they walked towards the playroom where Emily was waiting. As they approached, Jessica could see Emily perched atop the slide castle platform. Mark called out to his daughter in a kind voice, but the effect on Emily was immediate and unsettling. The girl shuddered visibly and backed against the wall, refusing to slide down. "Emily, let's go," Mark said, his voice low and serious, though not overtly aggressive. He reached out his hand towards his daughter. Jessica watched as Emily hesitantly extended her own hand, her face etched with an expression that looked disconcertingly like fear. The girl slid down slowly, her movements reluctant as she followed her father out of the playroom. In the locker area by the gate, Jessica helped Emily with her bag and water bottle. The girl hesitated to put on her shoes, and when Mark crouched to help her, Emily suddenly bolted, running back towards the playroom. For a brief moment, Jessica and Mark shared a worried glance. Mark quickly broke the tension with a chuckle. "Seems like my kiddo likes it here, huh?" he said before following after Emily. Jessica watched as Emily struggled to reach the playroom door handle, which was intentionally placed high to be out of children's reach. Before she could open it, Mark caught up to her, scooping her into his arms. Emily began to cry, repeatedly saying, "I don't want to leave," her distress drawing attention from other staff and parents. "Be a good girl now, okay?" Mark said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We really need to head home. You can play again tomorrow." As Mark held Emily, Jessica helped put on the girl's shoes. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the situation, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. She had witnessed her fair share of tantrums during drop-offs and pickups, but there was something different in Emily's fearful expression. It hinted at more than just typical childhood fussiness. Still, without any solid evidence, Jessica had no clear reason to intervene. With a final exchange of goodbyes, Mark carried Emily out of the daycare, leaving Jessica standing at the door, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach as she watched them go. As soon as Mark and Emily disappeared through the daycare's front door, Jessica found herself greeting another parent who had been waiting patiently. She moved behind the administration desk, scanning the barcode of the newly arrived parent, but her mind was elsewhere. The image of Emily's distressed face kept flashing in her thoughts, along with the girl's cryptic words from earlier. Jessica tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling herself that she needed to focus on her work. But just as she was about to fully immerse herself in the task at hand, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning around, she saw another staff member, holding out a small, well-loved stuffed animal. "Oh," Jessica breathed, immediately recognizing the toy. It was Emily's favorite, a constant companion during her time at the daycare. The realization hit her. Emily must have forgotten it in her haste to leave, or perhaps in her reluctance to go. This explained why the girl had tried to run back to the playroom earlier. Without hesitation, Jessica took the stuffed animal from her colleague. "Can you cover for me at the desk for a few minutes?" she asked, already moving towards the exit. "I need to return this to Emily. They might still be in the parking lot." Her co-worker nodded, stepping in to take her place at the desk. Jessica hurried out of the building, the stuffed animal clutched tightly in her hand. The cool evening air hit her face as she stepped outside, her eyes scanning the parking lot for any sign of the girl and her father. To her relief, she spotted them, and the vehicle still parked in its spot. Mark and Emily appeared to have just finished getting into the car. Jessica quickened her pace, ready to call out to them, but something made her pause mid-step. Through the car's open window, she could hear Mark's voice, low and stern. "You weren't being a good girl back there, Emily. You're just like your mother, always causing trouble." Jessica felt her breath catch in her throat. The words weren't overtly abusive, but the tone sent a chill down her spine. She watched as Mark fastened Emily into her car seat, handing her a snack and her water bottle. His movements weren't rough, but there was a distinct lack of warmth in his interactions with his daughter. From where she stood, frozen in place and still clutching the stuffed animal, Jessica could see Emily. The girl wasn't crying anymore, but her demeanor had changed completely. She sat silently in her seat, eyes downcast as she accepted the water bottle and snack from her father. Lost in her observations and the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind, Jessica missed her opportunity to approach the car. Before she could gather herself, Mark had started the engine, and the red car was pulling out of the parking lot. Jessica cursed under her breath, angry at herself for hesitating. In that moment, she made a split-second decision that would change the course of her evening, and potentially Emily's life. She rushed back to her own car, determined to follow them. As she slid into the driver's seat, Jessica tried to rationalize her actions. She told herself it was just about returning the stuffed animal, that for some kids, their comfort objects were crucially important. Emily had clearly been upset about leaving it behind, interrupted by her father before she could retrieve it from the playroom. Jessica, as a young mother herself, understood the significance such items could hold for children. But deep down, she knew there was more to it than that. Her instincts were screaming that something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the need to make sure Emily was safe. With a deep breath, Jessica started her car and pulled out of the parking lot. The stuffed animal sitting on the passenger seat beside her, like a silent witness to her decision. As she merged onto the main road in her own car, following the red taillights of Emily's family car in the distance, Jessica couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into. But the memory of Emily's fearful face and Mark's cold words steeled her resolve. Whatever was happening, she was determined to get to the bottom of it, for Emily's sake. The evening traffic was light as Jessica carefully maneuvered her car, keeping a safe distance behind Mark's red vehicle. Her heart was pounding, a mix of adrenaline and anxiety coursing through her veins. She knew what she was doing was unconventional, perhaps even crossing a line, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't let her turn back. As she drove, Jessica reached for her phone, deciding she should at least let the daycare know about her sudden departure. She dialed the number, keeping her eyes on the road ahead. A staff member, not the one who had handed her Emily's stuffed animal, answered the call. "Sprout Daycare, how can I help you?" "Hi, it's Jessica Lane," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and casual. "I just wanted to let you know that I'll be away for a bit. A child forgot something at the daycare and I'm returning it." "Oh, okay," the staff member replied, sounding a bit surprised but not overly concerned. "No problem, we've got everything under control here." Jessica ended the call, feeling a small sense of relief that at least someone knew she had left the premises. She refocused her attention on the road, noticing that Mark's car seemed to be speeding up. At first, Jessica tried to match his pace, not wanting to lose sight of them. But as she glanced at her speedometer, she realized with a jolt that Mark was driving well above the speed limit. The uneasy feeling in her stomach intensified. As she drove, Jessica's mind raced, replaying the events of the afternoon. Emily's reluctance to leave the daycare, her cryptic words about home being different, and now Mark's reckless driving. It all painted a disturbing picture. Jessica tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps there was a family emergency, or maybe they were adjusting to a new routine with Emily's mother starting a new job. But no matter how she tried to frame it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The streets became quieter as they drove, the bustling city giving way to more residential areas. Jessica was careful to maintain a legal speed, which meant Mark's car was now quite a distance ahead of her. She strained her eyes to keep the red taillights in view, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they continued their journey, Jessica noticed the scenery changing. The urban landscape gradually gave way to more natural surroundings. They were entering the outskirts of Tacoma, where the city blended seamlessly with forested regions. Houses became more spread out, interspersed with patches of dense trees. Jessica had always appreciated the beauty of this area, where people could live close to nature while still being near the city. But now, as she followed Mark's car deeper into this semi-rural landscape, the encroaching forest felt ominous rather than peaceful. The road wound through the trees, occasionally offering glimpses of the setting sun through gaps in the foliage. Jessica checked the time on her dashboard. They had been driving for about 20 minutes now. Surely they must be nearing Mark and Emily's home. Just as that thought flickered through her mind, something unexpected unfolded. Up ahead, Mark's red car abruptly swerved off the main road, turning onto a narrow street that disappeared into an especially thick section of forest. It jolted to a sudden stop along the edge of the asphalt. Jessica's heart leapt into her throat. This wasn't a driveway or any kind of residential access road. It was leading off-road, disappearing into the shadowy depths of the woods. For a moment, Jessica hesitated. She slowed down as she got closer to the red car that is now parked by the side of the street. The memory of Emily's fearful face flashed in her mind, along with Mark's cold words in the parking lot. Without second thoughts, Jessica pulled her car to a stop as well, positioning it just behind Mark's vehicle, but partially obscured by the dense undergrowth. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she was sure it must be audible in the eerie silence of the forest. With dusk settled in, the trees appeared to crowd around their car, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The final traces of sunlight struggled to break through the dense canopy overhead. Jessica's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as she took a steadying breath, mentally rehearsing what she would say when she finally faced them. What she saw next made her blood run cold. In that moment, Jessica made another split-second decision. She knew she had crossed a line by following them this far, but she couldn't bear the thought of what might happen if she turned back now. The stuffed animal sitting on her passenger seat seemed to stare at her accusingly, a silent reminder of her purpose. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Jessica opened her car door. The cool, crisp air of the forest hit her skin, causing her to shiver involuntarily. She grabbed Emily's stuffed animal and stepped out of the vehicle, her shoes crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground. "Mr. Carter! Emily!" Jessica called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the forest. She watched, frozen in place, as Mark led Emily by the hand towards the forest entry. The little girl's reluctance was palpable even from a distance, her small form seeming to shrink as they approached the tree line. Mark whirled around at the sound of her voice, his expression a mix of shock and something darker that Jessica couldn't quite place. Emily, still clutching her father's hand, looked up with wide, fearful eyes. "Miss Jessica!" Mark's voice was tight with barely contained anger. "Have you been following us this entire time? What are you doing here?" Jessica held up the stuffed animal, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm so sorry to intrude, Mr. Carter. Emily forgot her stuffed animal at the daycare. I thought she might want it back, so I followed to return it." Emily's eyes lit up at the sight of her beloved toy, but she made no move to reach for it, instead shrinking further behind her father's leg. Mark's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You followed us all this way just to return a toy? That seems a bit excessive, don't you think?" Jessica felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and a touch of fear. "I know it might seem that way, but I know how important these comfort objects can be for children. I thought Emily might be upset without it." Mark's expression softened slightly, but there was still an edge to his voice when he spoke. "Well, I suppose that's thoughtful of you to go such an extra mile, but it wasn't necessary, you know. I believe she would have been fine without it for one night." As Jessica handed the stuffed animal to Emily, who hugged it tightly to her chest, she couldn't help but glance around at their surroundings. The forest seemed to loom even darker now, the shadows lengthening as the sun continued to set. "I'm sorry," Jessica said, unable to keep the concern from her voice, "but may I ask what you're doing out here in the forest with Emily? It's getting quite late." Mark seemed taken aback by the question, his eyes darting nervously between Jessica and the forest behind him. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, but then he cleared his throat and said, "Well, you see, Emily needed to use the bathroom urgently. She drank quite a lot in the car after all that crying and playing at the daycare." Jessica nodded slowly, trying to process this explanation, but she remembered that all the children had used the bathroom after class, as was their routine. Moreover, Emily didn't seem to be showing any signs of needing to relieve herself now. There was no fidgeting or the telltale pee dance that Jessica had come to recognize in her years of childcare. Still, she didn't want to push too hard. Perhaps the stress of the day had affected Emily's bladder control, or maybe the air conditioning in the car had something to do with it. Jessica decided to give Mark the benefit of the doubt, even as her instincts continued to scream that something was very wrong. "Of course," Jessica said, forcing a smile. "I understand completely." Mark nodded curtly, then turned to Emily. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go take care of business before you have an accident." As they turned to walk deeper into the forest, Mark looked back over his shoulder at Jessica. "Thank you for bringing the toy, but I think it's best if you head back now. I believe Emily needs some privacy." The dismissal was clear in his tone, and Jessica knew she had no choice but to comply. But as she watched them disappear into the shadows of the trees, Emily's small form clutching her stuffed animal tightly, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake by leaving. With a heavy heart, she turned back towards her car, the sound of twigs snapping under her feet seeming to echo accusingly in the stillness of the forest. As she reached for her car door, she paused, looking back one last time at the spot where Mark and Emily had vanished from view, her mind racing with indecision. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle evening breeze. Every instinct she had as a caregiver, every ounce of her training, was screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. But what could she do? She had no concrete evidence of any wrongdoing, just a gnawing feeling in her gut and a series of small, unsettling observations. Jessica climbed back into her car, leaving the door slightly ajar to better hear any sounds from the forest, but there was nothing but rustles of leaves. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. She hadn't even realized how hard her heart had been pounding until the quiet of the enclosed space pressed in around her, amplifying the rhythmic thud in her chest. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to take a deep, steady breath, then another, until the tightness in her chest loosened just enough to think clearly. She glanced at her phone, considering for a moment whether she should call the police. But what would she say? That a father had taken his daughter into the woods to use the bathroom? It sounded ridiculous even in her own mind. Finally, she decided she should drive away. Staying there longer will only lead to more problems should they return, and saw that she was still there lingering around. It would be a confrontation she wasn't prepared for. With a shaky exhale, she turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, its familiar hum grounding her. For a split second, she considered making a U-turn, heading straight back to the daycare, convincing herself this was all just a misunderstanding, a moment of overthinking. But as she glanced toward the dense forest, a chill slid down her spine. There was no sign of Mark or Emily. The unease that had been simmering in her gut flared into something sharper, more urgent. Her heartbeat, which she had just managed to calm, surged again, thudding in her ears like an alarm bell. She swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the perimeter around her. She knew that just a few meters up, there's a gas station. An idea formed in her mind. She would stop there, use the time to gather her thoughts and decide on her next move. That would also be a good time to wait and see if their car was leaving. Jessica started the engine and returned back onto the main road. True to her memory, she spotted the flickering neon sign of a gas station cutting through the dimming light. The thought of leaving without knowing what was going on gnawed at her, but the idea of following them deeper into the woods felt reckless. Instead, she decided on a compromise. Easing the car into drive, she pulled forward, the tires crunching softly over gravel as she made her way toward the station. As she parked near the edge of the lot, angled just enough to keep a clear view of the dirt path, Jessica killed the engine and let the silence settle around her. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the background, but her focus remained on the darkened tree line. She would wait. She needed to be sure, because deep down something told her that whatever was happening in those woods wasn't right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Emily needed her to notice. While waiting for the sign of the red car, Jessica reached for her phone. She knew she needed more information about the family if she ever need to involve the authorities. She opened the cloud drive of the Sprout Daycare and accessed the customer database. She quickly looked up the Carter's contact information and address. While checking the map on her phone for their address, Jessica was startled to realize that their house was actually very close by. The realization only deepened her sense of unease. Why had Mark felt the need to stop in the forest when they were nearly home? Driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, Jessica found herself opening her social media apps, searching for Mark and Emily's mother. Their online profiles were sparse, with few posts and even fewer photos. The pictures she did find of Mark with Emily were striking. In none of them was the little girl smiling, and Emily's mother was conspicuously absent from every shot. The more Jessica dug, the more her concern grew. There was something off about this family, something that went beyond the usual stresses and strains of everyday life. But what could she do about it? As she sat there, the minutes ticking by agonizingly slowly, Jessica realized how hungry and thirsty she was. She hadn't eaten since lunch at the daycare. Spotting the gas station convenience store, she decided to grab something quick to eat and drink while she waited. Jessica got out of her car and walked into the store. The fluorescent lights inside were a stark contrast to the dimming evening outside. She ordered a coffee and picked up a pastry, paying at the counter with slightly shaky hands. As she turned to leave, coffee in one hand and pastry in the other, Jessica froze. Through the store's glass door, she saw a red car speed past on the road. It was unmistakably Mark's car. Without hesitation, Jessica rushed out of the store. She hurried to her car, hastily placing the coffee cup in the compartment and tossing the uneaten pastry onto the passenger seat. Her heart racing, she started the engine and reversed out of the parking spot. Jessica merged onto the road, her eyes scanning frantically for any sign of Mark's red car. As she approached the intersection, she realized with a sinking feeling that she had no idea which way they had gone. For a moment, she felt lost and overwhelmed. Then, taking a deep breath, Jessica made a decision. She pulled up the map on her phone's GPS, quickly entering the Carter's home address that she had looked up earlier. Trusting her instinct that Mark would be heading home, she set off in that direction. The streets grew quieter as Jessica entered the Carter's residential area. Houses became more spread out, interspersed with patches of the forest that seemed to dominate this part of Tacoma. She slowed her car, eyes scanning for the address she had committed to memory, and then she saw it, a white-painted house with a red car parked outside, the Carter's home. Jessica's heart pounded as she carefully parked her car a few houses away, making sure she had a clear view of the Carter residence. As she switched off her engine, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What would she do now? What could she do? As Jessica sat there, watching the quiet house and wondering what was happening inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to witness something that would change everything. The stillness of the suburban street wrapped around Jessica as she sat in her parked car, her gaze locked on the Carter's house bathed in the deepening indigo light. The white exterior of the building seemed to emit a gentle glow in the fading twilight, presenting a serene facade that masked the growing unease twisting in Jessica's stomach. She had lowered her car windows slightly, allowing the cool evening air to filter in. The gentle breeze carried with it the scent of pine from the nearby forest and the faint, homey smell of someone's dinner cooking. It was all so normal, so mundane, that for a moment Jessica wondered if she had imagined the entire strange sequence of events that had led her here. Reaching for the cold coffee she had hastily purchased at the gas station, Jessica took a sip, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. She hadn't added any sugar or cream in her rush to follow Mark's car. As she set the cup back down, she caught sight of the pastry she had also bought, still untouched on the passenger seat. Jessica picked up the pastry, brushing off a few stray crumbs that had fallen onto the seat. She was about to take a bite when a sudden sound made her freeze, the pastry halfway to her mouth. The noise was faint but unmistakable, the sharp, brittle sound of breaking glass. Jessica's heart began to race as she strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It had come from the direction of the Carter's house. She was sure of it. For a few moments all was quiet again. Jessica held her breath, wondering if she had imagined the noise, but then, carried on the still evening air, came another sound that made her blood run cold. "Stop, please, not in front of our daughter." The woman's voice was filled with fear and desperation, clearly audible even from Jessica's position down the street. Without thinking, Jessica dropped her pastry and reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the camera app, ready to record anything that might happen next. As she pointed her phone towards the house and zoomed in, Jessica saw silhouette movement through one of the front windows. A figure, Mark she assumed, appeared briefly, reaching up to close the curtains. The action was swift and decisive, as if he had suddenly realized the windows were open and wanted to hide what was happening inside. Jessica's heart thudded violently in her chest as she pressed the record button on her phone. Despite the drawn curtains, faint sounds seeped through the walls. A woman's muffled whimpers and the harsh, low rumble of male voices laced with anger. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the white fabric, and her breath caught as she saw the unmistakable outline of someone lifting a baseball bat, the movement sharp and deliberate. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. Emily's reluctance to leave the daycare, her cryptic comments about home being different, Mark's strange behavior, it all pointed to a terrifying reality that Jessica had desperately hoped wasn't true. With shaking hands, Jessica ended the recording and dialed 911. As the phone rang, she tried to steady her voice, knowing she needed to be clear and concise. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice came through the speaker. I need to report a possible domestic violence incident, Jessica blurted, her voice shaky and urgent. I'm parked outside a house, and I can hear a woman screaming inside. I think she's in danger. Can you give me the address, ma'am? Jessica rattled off the Carter's address, her eyes never leaving the house as she spoke. Please hurry, she added. There's a child in the house too. Officers are on their way, the dispatcher assured her. Can you tell me your name and if you're safe where you are? My name is Jessica Lane. I'm in my car parked down the street. I don't think they know I'm here. Okay, Jessica. I want you to stay in your car and keep yourself safe. The police should be there very soon. Can you tell me anything else about what you're seeing or hearing? As Jessica opened her mouth to respond, she saw the front door of the house open. Mark stepped out, alone. Even from a distance, Jessica could see that something was different about him. His movements were jerky, almost frantic, and there was a darkness in his expression that sent a chill down her spine. He's coming out of the house, Jessica whispered into the phone. The man, he's alone. He looks angry. She watched as Mark strode towards his car, his steps purposeful and direct. As he reached for the car door, Jessica noticed something that made her gasp. There's a scratch on his arm, she told the dispatcher. He's trying to cover it with his sleeve, but I can see it. Just as Mark was about to get into his car, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police cars rounded the corner, their lights flashing brightly in the gathering darkness. They screeched to a halt in front of the house, and 4 officers poured out, their weapons drawn. Police, stay where you are, hands in the air, one of the officers shouted. Mark froze, his hand still on the car door handle. Slowly he raised his hands, his face a mask of shock and fury. Jessica's attention was drawn away from this scene by movement in one of the house's windows. Her heart clenched as she saw Emily's small face peering out, the little girl's eyes wide with fear as she clutched her stuffed animal to her chest. The child, Jessica said into the phone, her voice breaking slightly. I can see her in the window. She looks scared, but I don't think she's hurt. The officers will make sure she's safe, the dispatcher assured her. You've done a great job, Jessica. Is there anything else you can see? Everything looks okay now. The police are handling it, she reported. Good. Thank you for your report, Jessica. We'll take it from here. With that, the line disconnected, leaving Jessica staring at her phone, her heart still pounding. As the officers approached Mark, Jessica saw one of his hands twitch, moving slightly towards the inside of his car. The reaction from the police was immediate. Don't move. Keep your hands where we can see them, an officer barked, his weapon trained steadily on Mark. Mark's hand stilled, and he slowly moved both hands above his head again. The officers quickly closed in, securing him, and beginning to search his person and the car. One officer patted him down, another circled around to the driver's side, flashlight beam cutting through the dim interior of the vehicle. The officer frisking Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object, a house key. He held it up, exchanging a quick, knowing glance with his partner, before passing it off to another officer who immediately headed toward the front door of the house. Meanwhile, at the car, the officer's flashlight stopped abruptly on something wedged between the driver's seat and the center console. He leaned in, his breath fogging up the cool glass for a moment before he popped the door open. Reaching inside, he pulled out a large, heavy hammer, its metal head glinting ominously under the streetlights. The officer's jaw tightened. It was clear Mark had been reaching for this before they'd stopped him. Got a weapon here, the officer called out, holding the hammer up for the others to see. Jessica gasped at the sight of the hammer from her car window. One of the officers by Mark gave him a hard look, his grip on Mark's arm tightening slightly as they escorted him toward a patrol car. Another officer carefully bagged the hammer, marking it as evidence before placing it in the trunk of one of the cruisers. At the front door, the key clicked in the lock, and the officer pushed the door open cautiously, hand resting on his holster as he called out, "Police, is anyone inside?" His voice echoed into the dim interior, but there was no immediate response. The officers exchanged quick, tense glances before stepping inside, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they secured the scene, determined to ensure no further danger lingered within. As Jessica watched the scene unfold before her, she felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. The police had secured Mark, and paramedics were now arriving on the scene, their van parking behind the police cars. With trembling hands, Jessica put her phone away into her pocket. She reached out the door handle and pushed it open. The cool evening air hit her face as she walked towards the house, her heart pounding with each step. As she approached, she could see Mark's face contorted with anger, his eyes locking onto her with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You," he spat, straining against the handcuffs. "You've been stalking me and my daughter. Officer, arrest her. She's been following us." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine at his words, but she stood her ground. One of the officers turned to her, his expression questioning. "Ma'am, is this true? Have you been following this man?" Jessica took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm Jessica Lane, the one who called 911. I work at Sprout Daycare, where Emily, their daughter, is enrolled. I followed Mr. Carter because I was concerned for Emily's safety." She held up her phone. "I have a recording of what I saw and heard happening inside the house." The officer nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We'll need to take a statement from you, Ms. Lane. For now, please wait here while we secure the scene." As the officer turned back to his colleagues, Jessica's attention was drawn to the front door of the house, which was now opening. Two officers emerged with a girl who Jessica immediately recognized as Emily. The little girl looked frightened but unharmed. When she saw Jessica, she ran to her, wrapping her arms around the caregiver's legs. "Hey, sweetie," Jessica said softly, crouching down to Emily's level. "Everything's going to be okay now. You're safe." Emily looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Miss Jessica," she whispered, "Mommy's in the bathroom. Daddy locked her in." Jessica's heart sank at these words. She quickly relayed this information to the nearest officer, who immediately radioed his colleagues inside the house. Jessica returned to Emily's side, her mind racing but her face calm. She gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind Emily's ear, grounding herself in the small act of care. From inside the house, faint voices crackled over the officers' radios, but Jessica kept her focus on the trembling girl in front of her. She could feel Emily's fear like a pulse in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jessica took a slow breath, softening her voice as she spoke, hoping to ease the fear clawing at the little girl's heart. "Miss Jessica," she whispered, "I'm scared. Is Mommy going to be all right?" "It's okay, Emily," Jessica murmured, her eyes warm and kind. "You can tell me anything. I'm here to help." Emily fiddled with the edge of her sleeve, her big brown eyes darting to the floor. Her thin shoulders trembled slightly, but Jessica's calm presence seemed to offer a fragile sense of safety. After a moment of silence, Emily's voice finally broke through, soft and hesitant. This is what I meant earlier," Emily whispered, her words quivering like fragile glass. She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "But Dad never hurt me. He always said if I don't tell anyone about what he does to Mom, he won't do it to me." Jessica's heart clenched, but she kept her face composed, nodding gently, silently urging Emily to go on. Emily's small fingers tightened into fists, but this morning, he was angry. He got mad because I didn't want to go to daycare with him, and at pickup too, like you saw, Miss Jessica. Jessica's chest felt heavy, but she kept her voice soft. "Emily, can you tell me about the forest? When you said you needed to pee, was that really why you went in?" Emily's eyes flickered with fear, her lips pressing into a thin line before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the way home, he asked me real sudden if I wanted to go in the forest with him," she said, her gaze distant as if she was reliving the moment. "I said no. I told him I was scared of the forest. I just wanted to go home." Jessica's breath hitched, but she kept her posture relaxed, her hand resting gently on the mat between them, offering comfort without pressure. Emily's words tumbled out faster now, like she needed to get them out before they swallowed her whole. But he didn't listen. He took my hand and pulled me in. We went deep, deeper than I've ever been. And then he stopped and showed me a tree. Her voice wavered, eyes glossing over. He said that's where he'd chain me up and leave me if I ever refused to go to daycare with him again. Jessica felt her throat tighten, her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, to be the safe harbor Emily needed. He said, "My time being Mommy's girl is over," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to spill. "He said I need to grow up now." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat, leaning in just a little closer, her voice steady, though her heart screamed inside. "Emily, you're so brave for telling me this," Jessica whispered. "You did the right thing. I'm going to make sure you're safe, okay? You don't have to be scared anymore." Emily's small body shuddered with quiet sobs as Jessica gently wrapped her arms around her, holding her like the fragile, precious child she was. Moments later, Jessica saw movement at the front door. 2 officers appeared, flanking Madeline Carter. Her face was bruised, her lips split and swollen. Her hair was disheveled, and she held herself gingerly, as if every movement caused her pain. As soon as Madeline saw Emily, she called out to her daughter. Emily ran to her mother, and Madeline enveloped her in a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. Jessica watched the reunion, her heart heavy with the weight of what this family had endured. One of the officers gently touched Jessica's shoulder. "Ma'am, we need to get them checked out by the paramedics. Can you bring the child over?" Jessica nodded, standing up and approached Emily and Madeline still in her arms. As they walked towards the ambulance, she could hear Mark's angry voice behind them, still hurling accusations and threats. "You just wait. I'll show you what I can do to that filthy daycare," he shouted as the police shoved him into the car. Jessica did not heed what he said. Instead, they continued making their way to the ambulance. At the ambulance, Jessica reluctantly handed Emily over to a kind-faced paramedic. She watched as both Emily and Madeline were examined, her heart breaking at the sight of their injuries and distress. A police officer approached Jessica, notepad in hand. "Ms. Lane, we need to take your statement now. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Jessica nodded, taking a deep breath before recounting the events of the evening. She described Emily's behavior at the daycare, her decision to follow Mark's car, the strange stop in the forest, and finally, what she had heard and seen outside the house. As she spoke, Jessica could see the officer's expression growing more serious. When she finished, he looked up from his notes with a grim expression. "Thank you, Ms. Lane. What you did today, it was extraordinary. Not many people would have trusted their instincts the way you did. You should be proud of yourself. Your actions may well have saved 2 lives tonight." He paused, his eyes flickering towards the car where Mark was now arrested. Jessica nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. As the officer walked away, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Miss Jessica." She turned to see Madeline standing there, Emily clinging to her leg. Despite her injuries, Madeline's eyes were clear and filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Madeline said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't followed us—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm just glad you're both safe now," she said softly. Madeline nodded, then took a deep breath. "It wasn't always like this," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When Mark and I first got married, he was different. He was kind, patient even, but everything changed after he met another woman at his job at the tech company." She paused, glancing down at Emily, who was listening intently. The sight seemed to give her strength to continue. "The other woman, she used him, manipulated him over the years. He poured everything into that company, and she finally got big enough shares in it until she took the company away from him. At first it was just a small affair, and I had warned him, trying to be faithful for Emily's sake, but he never listened." Madeline's voice grew softer, filled with pain and regret. Their relationship carried on, and eventually he got completely manipulated. When he lost everything, he blamed me instead, said I wasn't good enough and made him cheat. He started to snap over little mistakes. Our relationship was never the same, no matter how many times I've tried to restore it. Jessica listened, her heart heavy with the weight of Madeline's words. She could see now how a seemingly perfect family had crumbled, leaving behind the broken pieces she had witnessed today. As Madeline finished speaking, a police officer approached them. "Mrs. Carter, we need you and your daughter to come down to the station to give your statements. And you as well, Ms. Jessica. We'll need that recording you mentioned. Are you feeling up to it?" Madeline and Jessica exchanged nods while her mother gently squeezed Emily's hand in reassurance. As they began to follow the officer, Madeline glanced back at Jessica one final time. "Thank you," she said again, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved us both today." Jessica watched as they walked away, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. As she turned to follow another officer to her own car, she caught sight of Mark being driven away in a police cruiser. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, filled with a hatred that made her shudder. As Jessica climbed into her own car to follow the police to the station, she couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. What had started as a simple act of returning a forgotten toy had turned into something far more significant. She had trusted her instincts, followed her gut feeling, and in doing so, had potentially saved 2 lives. The weight of that realization settled over her as she drove, following the police cars through the quiet streets of Tacoma. Jessica knew that the night was far from over. There would be statements to give, questions to answer, and no doubt difficult times ahead for Emily and Madeline. But as she drove, Jessica felt a sense of purpose solidifying within her. She had made a difference today, and she was determined to continue doing so for Emily, for Madeline, and for all the other children and families who might be suffering in silence. The lights of the police station came into view, and Jessica took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. And that, she realized, was all that truly mattered.